But today we're starting a new series called A Different Kind of Christmas. So we're going to be looking at the underbelly of what Christmas is all about. All the commercialism, all the festivities, all that stuff, we're going to set that aside, and we're going to look deeper at what Christmas is calling us to do and be, not just think and all the warm, fuzzy feels and like that. So next week we will have a very different kind of Christmas program, and today we're going to talk about a different kind of Christmas. Today we're going to talk about the worst Christmas ever. And thinking back on Christmases from our childhoods, most of us will generally be able to come up with lots of beautiful memories, right? Drinking eggnog, decorating the Christmas tree, listening to that one Christmas album that your family always put on when you started decorating, right? Like for our family, for Jenny and I, it's always been Harry Connick Jr. Christmas, the second one, the red one, just in case you're wondering, the one that opens with Rudolph. Anyway, and that's been our go-to. But now the kids have kind of taken control of the playlist, so it's generally the Chipmunks. Yeah. So lots of beautiful, fun Christmas memories. But then some of us have not so great Christmas memories that are kind of mixed in there, here and there. The one thing that I can recall from my childhood is when I was about 6. So this is 1980-something. And computers are suddenly a thing. Like I have this in my consciousness now that computers are important and smart people have them. And so I should have a computer, therefore, as a 6-year-old in the 80s, because that makes tons of sense. And since, computers were super cheap back then anyway. And so I asked for a computer and went through all my presents waiting to open the computer. No computer was to be found. And then surveying the landscape of the presents I had opened, I was like, oh, this toy robot thing that you put cards in and press it. And it's like, you pressed blue. Yay. It's like that was supposed to be my computer. And I was a bit dejected in that moment. So on the grand spectrum of bad Christmases, that's not so bad. I was with a friend last night who told me about his worst Christmas was just a few years ago because he was throwing up all of Christmas. And like he said, he felt like his shoes were going to come out his mouth. And those were his words. And to make things even better, so he had to stay home from extended family Christmas on Christmas Day. And they did not believe him that he was sick. And so they did a drive-by, are you actually sick? Actually an inspection to verify that he's not just skipping out on them and hanging out with a cooler family. So anyway, there are lots. We all have our bad Christmas stories. And some of the Christmas movies we love are the ones where everything goes wrong, too. Like National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, A Christmas Story, things like that. But if you think your worst Christmas was bad, consider how miserable that first Christmas must have been. First, it starts with a surprise pregnancy. Right? Who doesn't love a good old-fashioned surprise pregnancy? So Mary's pregnant, and Joseph, her fiancé, is going to divorce her quietly, which is actually very noble in their day. Joseph could have dragged her out in the street and announced publicly that he was not the father of this child, and gotten her labeled as an adulterer. And this would have gotten her ousted from the community entirely. She would have been an utter outcast. And that's the way the ancient world understood women. They were objects who were either in or out. They were for the purposes of use and abuse, and then you could toss them aside when you're done with them. And it's actually quite remarkable to think how little things have changed in that regard over the last 2,000 years. Too often, women are still viewed as objects to be used and discarded. And we've heard a lot lately in the news about powerful men who abuse their authority over women and use their power to keep their victims silent. But lately, again, we've been hearing in the news this silence has been breaking. It seems like every day or two we learn about a new public figure who's under investigation for sexual misconduct. And it's beginning to feel like the days when abusers could hide behind a shield of intimidation and subjugation. It feels like those days are starting to come to an end. And to that, I say, bring it on. Right? Are you with me? I think Joseph would say, bring it on, as he protected the dignity of Mary. And I think Mary would have said, bring it on. If you remember, after she heard the news that she would give birth to the Messiah, she sang a song in Luke 1, and one of the lines went like this. This is God, God has brought down princes from their thrones and exalted the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away with empty hands. Sounds a little like what's going on these days. So Mary's like, bring it on. God is on the side of the oppressed, always. On the side of the outcast, always. God is on the side of the overlooked. God does not question the motives of victims, and neither should we. God comforts them and comes to their aid, and as followers of Jesus, so should we. And we see that truth clearer and clearer at that first worst Christmas. So far we've got questions of paternity and teen pregnancy at our first Christmas ever. We're doing pretty good. It's beginning to sound less like Christmas and more like a daytime talk show, right? Joseph, you are not the father, right? And as if this wasn't awkward enough, Christmas dinner conversation for that first Christmas, now we're going to start talking politics. Okay? In case you didn't notice, not our politics right now, but those politics then. In case you didn't notice, there's a very specific reason why Joseph and Mary were going to Bethlehem in the first place on that first Christmas. And it was the city of Joseph's lineage. So his hometown from generations ago. And the Roman government was forcing all the Jews who were living in that region to travel to their hometowns so that they could be counted for an official census. And what could be more fun than a census, right? It's awesome. So we've got teen pregnancy, questionable fatherhood, we've got political implications, we've got a census. This is turning out to be quite the festive holiday. Yes, so you see, Israel was, so here's what's even better than a census, though. When your census includes the forced migration of an entire nation of people in a time when travel is slow and expensive. So, hey, all of you Jewish people living in this area, you all have to move around all at the same time and go to the place of your hometown. It's incredibly complicated. You see, Israel was an occupied territory of the Roman Empire at this time. Israel had its own king, King Herod, huge jerk, but he wasn't really in charge. He had to answer to Rome. And why do you need, if you're Rome, why do you need to have a census? Why do you need to count the people? For taxation purposes, of course, right? Rome didn't wind up in Israel to liberate them from a dictator. Rome came to liberate them from their resources. Israel was oppressed politically, militarily, and economically. So if you were writing the story of how the Savior of the world would arrive on the scene, would you pick a politically, militarily, economically oppressed nation and a household of teen pregnancy and questionable paternity? Is that the story of how the king arrives? If you're setting pen to paper? And we haven't even talked about the manger yet, right? This unwed mother and her "you are not the father" husband Joseph lay their newborn son of God here to save the world in an animal's feed box for his first baby bassinet. Now, the story we tell is that there was no room for them in the inn, but that's actually not exactly how it works. You see, in ancient Near Eastern culture, the world where Jesus was born into, hospitality was one of the primary values that everyone held. They didn't have to have proper hotels because if you were out of town and needed a place to stay, you just knocked on someone's door. And then they fed you, they gave you a place to sleep, and sent you with God's blessing in the morning. Or If you had to stay longer, they're fine with that too. Think of it like an Airbnb, only free, and you have to sleep on the floor. It's like that. And most homes in Jesus' day were simple, rectangular, two-story buildings. There's a nice diagram here that I found. The upper floor was the living space, and the lower floor was where animals were kept. And on warm Mediterranean nights, most families would sleep on the roof, actually, because it's a beautiful place to sleep outside. And there are actually very specific rules in the Old Testament. When you build your house, there's this thing called parapets, which is like a little fence that goes around the outside of your roof. And you have to have your parapets this tall. Otherwise, when people are sleeping on your roof, they might fall off. And it was actually like against Jewish law to not have parapets of a certain height. Anyway, fun fact for the day. So living space, second floor. Animals, first floor. The family that lives there sleeps on the roof. Now, what happens when Rome calls a census and your entire town is flooded with travelers from all over the region who all need a place to stay? Well, if the roof is full and you've already welcomed people into your living area, when you have guests come and stay, they sleep in your living area and you're sleeping on the roof. So what happens if the town is full of travelers, you've already welcomed a family to sleep in your living area, and you're up on the roof? What's the leftover spot? The main floor where the animals are, not some separate barn, not the stables of some country inn and suites, Bethlehem edition. They'd wind up downstairs with the animals. Now, when the King James translators of the first English Bible, the first widely published English Bible, I should say, when they found this Greek word, in the original texts of the New Testament that described where Mary and Joseph couldn't sleep, they brought in something familiar from their own culture, an inn. But the truth is, they were indoors. Mary, Joseph, and Jesus were indoors with the animals, sleeping below other travelers in town for the census, who were sleeping below their hosts who had made their beds on the roof for the night. And that's what this actual story probably looked like on the first Christmas. It's like if you asked if you could crash on your buddy's couch, but there was already someone sleeping there, and so he made you sleep in the garage. Like a garage with manure in it. The worst Christmas ever, right? The King of Kings and Lord of Lords was born to illegitimate parents in a ghetto of the Roman Empire in a stranger's basement stable. Can I just say, whatever circumstances you were born into, it wasn't that bad. It was definitely, whatever you were born into was better than this. But this is the place that God showed up. This is the place where love came down to live with us. This hot mess of a holy family is where the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So hang on to this thought, and then remember the last awkward part of this Christmas story. Who were the first people to come and visit this newborn Jesus? We all know. Oh, no, the first ones, before them even, were the shepherds. Yes. Shepherds were some of the filthiest, most disliked groups of people in Jesus' day. All right, we think of shepherds as this noble profession. Nope, not back then. They had to stay with their sheep night and day to protect them and to lead them to food and to water. So these shepherds never participated in the religious rituals of their culture. They were outcast from every corner of their world except for the expanse of the night sky and their filthy, smelly sheep. And so if an angel appeared to the shepherds and told them that there was a new king born in a palace with white linen sheets and a gilded crib, what do you think their response would have been? Big whoop, right? That's them and this is us. That's a whole different, that's the other half. He would never want anything to do with me, so why would I want to have anything to do with that guy? Those hotshots never cared about us. Why should we care about them? But when the new king is like them, lying in a manger, wrapped up in everyday cloths, now this is a king worth checking out. Right? The angel said, I bring you good news that will bring great joy to all people. Not just for the rich, not just for the well-connected, not just for the religious. The birth of Jesus is good news for all people. And here's why. If you're feeling low, if you're poor, if you're wandering, if you're feeling filthy from the life you've lived, you can turn to Jesus and know he understands exactly how you feel. Because he's been there too. And that's why I want to challenge you to have a different kind of Christmas. Because we have a very different kind of Christ. We have a very different kind. This Jesus is a king for wandering shepherds who religion left behind. This Jesus is a king for single moms and victims of every kind. This Jesus is a king for those who open up their homes. This Jesus is a king for the oppressed and the alone. And with all of this context, all this kind of backstory of the world that God entered into on that first Christmas, I would like to share with you a song. I've written one Christmas song ever. I might have played it a couple years ago, I don't know. But I'd like to share that with you today. All right. It'll make a lot more sense now, I think, after kind of hearing the backstory. So, but there's one caveat. So I wrote this song before I learned about ancient Near Eastern architecture. So I make very specific references to an inn and an innkeeper, even though there probably was no such thing. But I think you'll forgive me. In a feed box, in a barn, in a backwater town, there he lay, a baby boy, too small to wear his crown. But he was king all the same. The angels called him by name. This little nobody in rags was good news. In a pasture not so far from that backwater town, they were standing with their sheep when the message came around. The kinds of kings that carry swords, they don't rule you anymore. And so for flocks of nobodies, it's good news. And the news was good for the innkeeper, and the news was good for those who couldn't earn their keep. And the news meant that no army could hold back their hope. The news is good. The news is good. The news is good. in the high and mighty capital, over that backwater town. The priest, he prayed for the day they could throw their captors down. And as those very words were spoken, the prison doors were flying open. Even if nobody's prepared for good news. And the news was good for the lions, and the news was good for flocks of wandering lambs, and the news meant that their years of hoping weren't in vain. The news is good. 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 The news is good.